You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
We were talking this afternoon, Dave and I, about the Brit Awards in 1992 at the Hammersmith Odeon, and we could only remember one moment from this, which you can imagine what it would have been, which is that the KLF came on with Extreme Noise Terror and machine-gunned the audience so deafeningly that the composer Sir George Salty, who was sitting right in front of us, leapt to his feet, poor old boy, stuck his fingers in his ears and ran for the exit. If he'd got to the exit, which he may well have done, he would have seen, of course, a dead sheep that had been kindly deposited by the group outside. And it made me think, this is a fantastic story. It's a fantastic, unique story. This is a group with a catalogue of absolutely extraordinary, really inventive pop singles and an equally extraordinary rack of art terrorist moments. And this story has been wonderfully told by the author of this book, the KLF, Chaos, Magic, and the Band That Burnt £1 Million. So successful 10 years ago that it's now been put out in its 10th anniversary edition with extra material. And its author is the great John Higgs. So please welcome John.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
So, John, you were presumably always, interested in the KLF and that story. Was it at the time, or was that?
Not at the time, actually. I was more of a rock guy.
Yeah.
I wasn't. The dance music passed me by slightly.
Yeah.
It was just. I still remember that weekend when you got the paper at the weekend, got the Observer, and you opened the magazine, and there was a story in there by the journalist Jim Reed about how Bill Drummond and Jimmy Cauty had gone up to the island of Jura with a suitcase full of £50 notes, totaling £1 million. And in the middle of the night, they'd found this deserted boathouse that just happened to have a fireplace at the end. And they'd spent a couple of hours setting fire to this money and burning all the money. And, there was something about reading this, and I just thought, well, I'm going to have to keep this article because it didn't make any sense to me. It didn't compute. Normally most subjects, you get your head round them, you can move on. But because this was just so totally inconceivable to me, it was so taboo, but it was more than that. It was just so nuts. I couldn't move on. I couldn't sort of get past it. I had to it kept ticking away at the back of my mind for about the next 17 years, It's always the things that make no sense that are the clues that your worldview is limited.
The music press,
the
music press played a big part in that story because, as a music journalist, writing about music is very hard.
Yeah.
Music is abstract, it's difficult to pin it down. But writing about stories about music is an absolute gift, and they were the most phenomenal gift in that department. Quickly, we must talk a little bit about, we've got some slides running behind us for anyone listening to the podcast. And just a bit of background on Bill Drummond. And there's Bill in Big in Japan with Ian Brody and Holly Johnson and Jane Casey on the left there. So he started off in theatre and then got into music. What were his ambitions at the time?
What, Bill Drummond? He was, I guess he's always been on what Julian Cope would call the art trip. Julian Cope once memorably said, "Never fall for the art trip," right? And I think that was a bit of a dig at Bill. Art is one thing, but the art trip, that's nothing. He'd been to art school. He'd been working at the Everyman in Liverpool doing sets. And then this strange, mad-eyebrowed ball of enthusiasm called Ken Campbell came into Liverpool and announced he was going to put on this 8-hour epic of the greatest conspiracy story ever told in basically this grotty old deserted warehouse down Matthew Street, which only had like one toilet, and Bill got the job of making the sets, but they had to be of a size that he could get them up this tiny staircase. So he had to create sets for a worldwide conspiracy epic on a tiny little sort of scale. And
perfect training for what was to come, actually.
It was when you have such extreme constraints that, genius flourishes, and then that's when you have the brilliant ideas, and that's why we're still talking about this Illuminatus play so many years later, because the people who were part of it and the people who were sort of changed by exposure to Ken Campbell have never been the same since. That Ken had this notion that it's only things that are impossible that are worth doing. Don't waste your time on anything that's possible. It's the impossible that you want to be doing. And Bill learned from him. His brief was, is it heroic? Is it heroic? That was his brief for all the sets. And he painted these words, is it heroic, in big letters on the wall. And he sort of got to work. And that's kind of shaped him ever since.
He was a kind of strategist from the start, wasn't he? I was going to just ask you briefly about his time when he managed both Echo and the Bunnymen and the Teardrop Explodes. There's a bit in the book where he says that his idea of a group is some people who get together and they have 3 or 4 hit singles, blaze of glory, and then they split up, go do something else. Whereas both these groups actually really thought they were in it for the long haul, and one of them clearly was, very successfully actually. So what did he bring to those two groups, do you think?
He initially recognised the brilliance of them, the sort of the real, visionary side of why they're remembered, why they're so special. He was not the guy to set them on a decades-long career. As you say, he thought there was something selling out about making an album. Really, you should make a brilliant single and split up. That was his idea. This wasn't what Echo and the Bunnymen wanted to do at all, and hence, they moved on and they signed to a major label and are still with us today, and they're announcing their next tour for next year. This very day. So he probably wasn't the ideal manager, but he was the ideal myth creator for them. Yeah. He could really. The image we have of Echo and the Bunnymen now is grandeur. It's slightly transcendent. It's slightly more than what a band should be, and that's how Bill saw it.
There's a wonderful moment where he wants both groups to play simultaneously, I think, in his favourite places. What was that about?
Two very important places from his childhood that seemed just ripe with meaning for him. One was just Iceland, which he visited when he was young, I think, and it was the epic sort of scale of the Icelandic sort of landscape that he associated with Echo and the Bunnymen.
Where they eventually did an album sleeve, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It fits them perfectly. But also he wanted Julian Cope to play in Papua New Guinea with The Teardrop Explodes, because he'd heard stories as a kid about his uncle was eaten by... he was a missionary. He'd gone to Papua New Guinea, was eaten, or something like that. So for him,
it was... twist these two groups into his own vision.
Fiery, wild, atavistic sort of place, which is exactly how he saw Julian Cope at that time. So he thought if he could put Echo and the Bunnymen in Iceland and The Teardrop Explodes in Papua New Guinea at the same time, then something would happen. He didn't know what, but it would certainly happen, and it would ripple through the world, and it would probably come up in Matthew Street, in Liverpool, in between, which is where Eric's was, which is where the Cavern was. And his idea was, at the time that both bands were playing, he would stand on the manhole cover in Matthew Street and see what would happen.
That's right.
Most band managers, they ain't thinking like this.
No.
This is not... And fortunately, or unfortunately, anyone who can tell Julian Cope to go and play a gig in Papua New Guinea when he doesn't want to,
just so their manager could stand on a manhole cover.
So it never happened, So at the same time, Echo when he did play in Iceland, and he did go and stand on the manhole cover. And also for his 60th birthday, he went back and stood on that manhole cover for 17 hours. This is Bill. This is Bill Drummond.
This is extraordinary.
It's ain't not many people like him.
No, there aren't.
Yeah.
No. So tell us a bit about Jimmy. We were looking at a picture here of the group Brilliant that Jimmy was in, and that's him on the top right there. And that on the right is a picture of a very famous poster that he did that Athena, I think, marketed of the Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely. He was very young when he did this Lord of the Rings poster, and everyone of certainly my age will recognise it. It was a massive hit. It was hugely successful. It was this. There used to be a shop chain called Athena for any younger listeners that would sell posters, and this drawing of Lord and Rings was a massive sort of hit. But Jimmy, he got into music. As I say, he was in this band, Brilliant with Youth, which Bill signed, and they did an album, and they did the album with Pete Waterman. And it did nothing. But Jimmy and Bill were able to sort of watch Pete Waterman just as he was moving into his hit factory sort of stage. And they sort of learned so much about the, I guess, sort of blatant attempts to make hit records that Pete Waterman sort of represented, certainly in the 80s. That it kind of, even though they were coming, from a very sort of post-punk, left-field, indie sort of way, to see what Pete Waterman could do was kind of inspiring. And they kind of both left the music industry after, Brilliant never took off, and Bill was going to go away and write a book, and he turned 33. They were too old. They were too old to be in the band. And they were going to give it all up. And then the notion that Jimmy had bought a sampler was sort of in Bill's head. And he'd been listening to Schoolie D. And, hip-hop was just sort of starting. And I think it was 1987, New Year's Day, he just sort of phoned him up and said, we should, form a band, and we should call ourselves the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo. Right? Which is I remember hearing that name on the radio, Justified Ancients of Moo Moo, and it just leapt out. I was like, what is that? Those words like justified, was that ancient? You didn't hear them on Radio 1. They weren't pop music words. This was coming from somewhere very, very different. And this was coming from a series of books called the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, which is what Ken Campbell had been adapting in Liverpool. So there's this really sort of underground mythology that they were tapping into, where the justified ancients of Moo Moo represented the forces of chaos who were at war against the music industry.
I was going to ask you about that, because there were 3 or 4 things I made a note of here. Robert Anton Wilson's the historical Illuminatus, Alan Moore, the picture also we're looking at of the Greek goddess Eris, the Greek goddess of chaos. And now I think they're quite divisive, these things, because people either really like this kind of literature or they find it really, really confusing and slightly off-putting. And I must admit, I'm in the latter camp. I've never read any of this stuff. And I'd like to know what Bill and Jimmy got out of reading these books that was part of the strategy of the group. How were they involved?
It's a very good question. I think to boil this sort of rich, world of literature down into a simple notion. The idea was that religions, belief systems, ideologies were all focused on order, on the order in the world. People would look at the world and they would see something elegant and beautiful and go, look at the order in the universe. Clearly there must be some divine force behind it. We should start a religion and worship the divine side of it. All this literature comes from the idea that really the universe is just chaos. It's just bubbling, seething, massive chaos, and we project onto it what we really want. And if anybody wanted to form a religion focused on something that was undeniably present, a concept that was undeniably present in the universe, then it's chaos. Then it's the Greek goddess Eris, the goddess of discord and disharmony and things like that. So these aren't your normal ideas to feed into late 80s pop music by a long shot, but they are.
Was it obvious that stuff was in there? Were they talking about that in interviews? I guess they were.
It was blatantly obvious, but at the same time, because no one was looking for it, no one was really commenting on it. it might be known that, okay, the name Justified Ancient Movement came from these books and stuff, but because no one was reading those books, it didn't sort of really sort of make any sense. But the sense that they were in some way against the music industry, I think that came across quite clear, that they were in some way not trying to destroy it, but trying to fight
Subvert
it.
it.
Subvert it,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
The Justified Ancient Movement, I'm trying to remember how they were sold, because their press officer, a guy called Mick Houghton, was an old
Yes.
pal of ours, and I must have been the editor of Q, I think, at the time. I'm trying to think what he would have been saying on the phone to try and get across what this group were all about, because the very early records, weren't they masquerading as kind of Scottish dockers or something?
Yeah.
I can't remember. They had some kind of persona that they occupied.
Yeah, absolutely. They claimed to be
So it was so
Clydeside
complicated, wasn't it?
Dockers, King Boy D and Rockman Rock. And those first albums, they're kind of putting on a bit of an accent, you know.
Yeah.
And Mick Horton, God bless him, thought, yeah, I best tell people it's Bill Drummond and Jimmy Cauty, because no one's going to be remotely interested, you know, otherwise. But they were known enough around this, particularly Bill, and from managing Echo and the Bunnymen and his time at Warner's and things like that. They were industry enough names, so he made it very clear, you know, who they were.
And also brilliant publicity things. There's the ABBA incident you'll have to explain, because there was a court case with ABBA, wasn't there?
There was, because a lot of this stuff about AI in music has reminded me of those times. Because at the time, sampling was new, and the sense of what was, you know, reasonable, you know, what was legal, what it should be used for, was very much up in the air. It was very sort of odd. It reminds me of now when people are just like, you know, using an AI plugin to change their voice into The Weeknd, or, you know, to Drake or something like that, and they put it on YouTube and people are appalled because how dare you do that sort of stuff. The KLF, they were sampling huge chunks of the Beatles and ABBA, right? Not just to get a beat or a sound back, but because they were the Beatles and ABBA. They were sort of like claiming them and subverting them and using them, and, you know, the fact that the lawyers came down so heavily on that first Jams album is really not surprising if you listen to it. It's not like they sampled a bit of ABBA. It's basically they played the record and then shouted over it occasionally.
Yeah.
That's closer to sort of what it was. And when they were shut down, Bill had this notion that if only they could explain to ABBA, artist to artist, what they're trying to do.
They'd be bound to understand.
Of course they do.
And we can tell them about the chaos theory too.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem. So there was this road trip where they got the ferry over to Sweden, and they were trying to find ABBA. ABBA weren't in Sweden at the time, and I think James Brown from NME sort of went with them, and he sort of added to the story by making a lot of stuff up, like the stuff about them being chased by a farmer with a shotgun and all this sort of stuff. Just totally sort of made
perfect.
it. But there's enough in there that actually happened that, like, they played their only gig as the Justified Ancient Movement on the ferry, were paid one Toblerone.
That's right.
Perfect. It's absolutely perfect. You know that has to be true. No one makes that up, you know, absolutely. And they'd found a prostitute that they said looked like Agnes. She didn't. And they got a photo with her taking it. It was a sort of... It sort of framed the way they were seen as sort of master medium manipulators, because a story would follow them, you know. Yeah. You see what they're up to. You could easily get, you know, 1,500 words out of that, and they'll be great. You know, they're much easier to write about than, you know, 808 State or something like that.
The Pale Fountains.
They were, they were a journalist's dream in some. And even though a lot of the early Jam single, they don't have a lot of supporters now, they were written about in such a way because of just how they acted, how Bill and Jimmy sort of acted, became.
But actually, the point that the group themselves was somehow more important at that time than the music they made. The whole concept of them was what people were excited about.
Possibly, but it's slightly overshadowed by how good they became.
Yeah.
As we got into the early 90s and they dropped their attempts at, shouty Scottish hip-hop and got into...
Well, I wanted to mention the Time Lords record.
Oh, yes, of course.
It struck me that Doctor Who was actually at a bit of a low point. It was a brilliant way of connecting with something that was part of the kind of cultural DNA of the audience that they really wanted to appeal to. But actually, I think the BBC were almost trying to get rid of it at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they may well have been responsible for its longevity and for keeping it going.
The moment they dropped it was really interesting because the BBC had been talking about Doctor Who on the grounds that, look, it's shit and we should get rid of it, right? And there was a campaign and it came back. They weren't quite prepared for how many people wanted it back. But when it came back, it still wasn't the best. And they thought, we'll get a new Doctor Who. And they got Sylvester McCoy. And the first series was very, it had Ken Dodd in it. It was, it wasn't the sort of serious sci-fi that many people were expecting. Bonnie Langford was in it. And it was quite a pantomime sort of elements. And there was a new script editor about to sort of take over, but he hadn't put his stamp on it. And in the public's estimation, it was as naff of it as it's ever been. I don't think there's any been, the great thing about Doctor Who is it's magnificent, but it's like awful at the same time. It can be very camp, it can be ludicrous, and it's very easy to sort of fall out of favour. And at that point, you weren't getting people supporting it. And that was the moment that they came out with this, I want to say novelty record, but I love it. It's not like novelty records.
Yeah.
I think Pete Perfidi's called it the only novelty record it's okay to love, or something like that, about Doctor Who. And the moment that, the moment Doctor Who came back after this, it was brilliant again. It suddenly found its mojo, and there was a new companion called Ace, and had a real sense of mystery to it again, that it had all been lost. But yeah, this came out at the sort of the lowest ebb for Doctor Who, and either they misread, culture, or they really get it on a deeper level. It's fascinating.
It's genius, absolute genius, because everybody connected, everyone could understand it, But the phase after this was the kind of KLF phase. And it's interesting, you make the point in the book that kind of rave culture had just arrived. And the main difference between that and rock music, in a way, was that rock music is an audience looking at a stage, and rave culture is an audience looking at an audience.
Yeah.
I can remember driving down to Glastonbury around this time and giving a load of hitchhikers a lift because I had an empty car. And I asked them what they were going to see, and they said they didn't know who was on. They were going to see Spiral Tribe, who were a kind of sound system just being on with a generator. And they had no idea and no interest at all in any of the groups, in any of the personalities. It was a real moment for me. I thought, my God, things really are changing. That's extraordinary.
It's so different from like the Led Zeppelin, like Golden God sort of thing, where the band on stage, they make this incredible noise and they project it out at the audience, and the audience are kind of like this parabolic mirror that sort of take it and reflect it back to glorify the people on stage, and they become, like 10 feet tall, amazing sort of heroes and stuff like that. That was the idea of, Led Zeppelin and bands like that. With rave music, the music was just reflected into the audience, who reflected to the rest of the audience, and it was to sort of make the audience like many inches taller than they had been when they came. It was to make them sort of these wonderful sort of divine beings, and they're all looking at each other. They're not all, this is before the superstar DJs sort of era, where people would look up at the guy playing records or something like that. It sort of wasn't that at all, and they.
So why did the KLF adopt that then? It's quite interesting because in some ways they were quite old for that kind of whole movement, but they saw the value of it, didn't they?
They were,
sort of
but
DIY punk ethic to some extent.
They're still of an age where if they could get some ease, and they went along, and they took the ease, and they weren't sure if anything was happening, and Bill turned to Jimmy and goes, "I wanted to ask, is anything happening?" But the sentence that came out was, "What time is love?" At that point, they knew it was working, and they knew that this.
I think that's perfect.
This was the music they wanted to make.
Yeah.
This was the This was now, you know.
Yeah,
this
yeah,
was
yeah.
this was fresh, and so they changed their name to the KLF because it was, you know, it wasn't about the heroes on stage. It was as anonymous as you could possibly be. It was just sort of 3 letters. So there are a lot of stories about what they may or may not mean, those letters. But at the time, it was just very sort of bold and, you know, industrial type sort of design, and very simple and clear and brilliant. They just got that stage where that especially when they got to those Stadium House singles a little bit later, the 3 a.m. Eternal, Last Train to Transcentral, Justified and Ancients. These are just phenomenal records, and if you play them now, they're so of the time, but they're also transcend it completely. They still sound brilliant. And they sound brilliant to, like, you know, a 3-year-old kid, and they sound brilliant to a 9-year-old woman. They just transcend everything. It was just this really glorious moment, and suddenly the KLF were the best-selling singles band in the world, having number one after number one after number one.
And wrote the manual, didn't they? How to have a number one the easy way. I'm trying to think of any of the salient points they made in that. Give us an example.
Oh, it was great. It's really about how the music industry operated at a specific, like, 6-month period in the late 1980s. All the advice about, you know, hiring a sampler and hiring a studio. The first thing was to go to the bank manager and borrow like £20,000 to, you know, pay for pluggers for ratings. So it's, in some ways, it's like completely irrelevant now. But a lot of the advice about the actual song still stands up. It's the obvious sort of stuff. It's the start with the chorus and use that title, and, you know, build on it, and, you know, it's
backfired slightly, didn't it? There
it
was
did
a
seem
people
cynical.
thought that they were cynical manipulators rather than these kind of chaos crusaders and freewheeling.
Absolutely, I think the intention, as they saw it, was. It was like that, the Sniffing Glue punk fanzine that had on the back page, here's 3 chords, now form a band. It was just giving people, you know, what they needed to have a number one. As they saw it, it was the first time in history where anyone could have a number one, because they could do it. Anyone could do it. So they were sort of trying to share that. But it was seen as this sort of clever sort of arch manipulatory sort of thing again. And so a lot of what they have done is always perceived as scams, like, or pranks or something like that, which they hate. They really hate, because they are genuine expressions of them as artists.
Well, what we're looking at now is a picture that also, I think, is thought by many as being a scam or a prank, which is a picture of a line of people, I think on the island of Jura, most of them in yellow robes, hooded robes, taking part in a ritual. Just remind us again what was happening there. It was the rites of Mu.
It was the rites of Mu. It was Midsummer's Evening, 1991, and they just invited a whole bunch of people from the record industry, and didn't tell them where they were just like, bring your passport, and didn't tell them where they were going. And they got on a plane, and they flew up to Scotland, got on a little plane, and got on a ferry, and they arrived at the Isle of Jura, and Bill was in like a customs officer outfit with a stamp in everyone's passport with like the Pyramid Blaster logo, which I think is illegal, but he was sort of, you know, sort of stamping away, and they were sort of marched across the island. They were given these robes. They were given a lot of MDMA. They were marched across the island.
Compulsory, made to take it.
To this wicker man. There's a giant wicker man there. And a sound system. And, you know, Jimmy was playing all this deep sort of rave music. And Bill, who, I think that's Bill at the front in the white with the big horn.
With a huge horn coming out where his face should be.
Started talking in tongues. Giving all this glossalia, I think it's called, this incomprehensible sort of language, but proclaiming in time to the music. And a lot of the journalists there have never quite been the same since. There's accounts of people who've moved back to Jura and had children. In Chris Atkins' film, that documentary, he speaks to a woman who, I think she was the researcher on the Steve Wright show. And she was invited along. And she was And now I think she's living on Jura with a child whose initials are KLF.
No.
Yeah.
She lives in a cave in some distant mountain peak.
I don't. Yeah, not quite, but it's not like they had a record to promote. There wasn't any reason for it other than like it's Midsummer and we should sort of do something like that. And
the big hit around this time, which we ought to mention, I think, was Justified and Ancient with Tammy Wynette. And I was thinking about that today because, when the Pet Shop Boys got in touch with Dusty Springfield and said, would you like to come out and work with us? We're a kind of electronic duo, etc., etc. What they were offering her was a very conventional song in some ways, which she could understand. But when the KLF got in touch with Tammy Wynette, I'm trying to imagine how the conversation could possibly have gone and how they convinced her to do what she eventually finished up doing, which was brilliant.
Yeah, it was superb. It came about, they were in the studio and they were working on something. It wasn't quite there. And Jimmy turned to Bill and said, what this song needs, Bill, is Tammy Wynette. Meaning something authentic, something true and authentic. But because Bill had, been taught by Ken Campbell that if something's impossible, that's what you do. He was like, okay, well, I'll get on the phone.
That's the challenge.
And within a few phone calls, he was speaking to Tammy Wynette, who was backstage at a conference in Memphis. And because of the route he'd been trying to get to her, I think had gone through the head of WEA or something like that. She thought, I better sort of take this. This is important. And so she thought, well, okay, I'll agree. I don't understand
So it did
this.
go through the record company. I just imagined that they'd somehow got in touch with her and she'd be thinking, who are these people,
I mean, when they sent her the lyrics, they're justified and they're ancient and they drive an ice cream van. God knows what she must have been.
Finally!
God knows. But she was a professional, and her way of singing does not hit the strong 4/4 beat of dance music in any way, shape or form. But fortunately, Jimmy had a quantizer or an early piece of technology where he could take each word and sort of hit the beat, damp, 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 damp. And they turned it into this, I think it was the first Billboard hit for Tammy Wynette for however many years, for sort of a long, long sort of time. And it really helped sort of reinvigorate her. So she was right to take it.
She went out and promoted, didn't she?
Yeah.
In fact, and it had to take time off through exhaustion, she claimed.
Yeah,
Worn
absolutely.
out
She was ill, I think, from having this hit all over Europe and I think in America. It really took it out of her. But it did... It's interesting, the video, it's got this scrolling thing saying Tammy Wynette, the first woman of country, this many Grammy Awards, this many #1 albums, all this stats about her. And now in the sort of post, pop idol sort of world, we're used to that sort of thing. That's how people would be introduced, on a Simon Cowell type program. The artists were sort of introduced by their Wikipedia sort of greatest hits sort of thing. At the time, it was weird. We didn't think of music like that. It was about the industry, not the song. It was just odd. It was just another of those things they did that was just weirdly ahead of its time, and we've sort of that seemed strange, but has now become completely normal.
And then the Brit appearance, which we were talking about earlier, I'm trying to think what point they were trying to make with that, really. Apart from the fact that they were announcing that they were packing it in.
I don't think they decided to exactly at that stage. But what I was talking about earlier is that they were supposed to be, against the music industry, trying to subvert the music industry. The Brit Awards were basically saying, you're successful. You're selling lots of records. You've made it. Come on in. Here's the keys to the kingdom. They won the Brit Award for Best Band, but they won it jointly with Simply Red. So what the music industry was saying was, you're the best a band can be. You're as good as Simply Red. And you can take that the wrong way.
Yeah.
Quite easy. But they were asked to do a performance at the start, and at this point, it's an indication of, I don't know, whether they were going wrong is the easy way to put it, but the intense pressure they'd been in all these years of all these hits and things. And they had this notion, Bill had this notion that, okay, we're going to open the Brit Awards. I should get a chainsaw and chop off my hand and like throw it into the crowd as if to reclaim the music industry for a greater good, like the old kings of Ulster, right? And most people, if you suggest something like that, will go, "No, Bill, don't do that. That's not a good idea. I think you might spoil something." But Bill and Jimmy sort of got each other. They never argued. Nothing was ever had to be discussed. They both saw the world in the same way. They both totally agreed, and so they were both a terrible influence on each other. Because when Bill suggests that, Jimmy's all goes thinking about it. And okay, and they didn't decide to chop off his hand, but they thought, we'll get a sheep and we'll dismember the sheep like live on stage with chainsaws, and we'll throw the bits of the sheep into the audience, and it will be so terrible we'll never be forgiven for it. We will do that. But it just so happened
we're still talking about it now.
They decided to do the performance with the grindcore band Extreme Noise Terror, right? There weren't many grindcore bands in the Brit Awards at this point. This was quite a shock to people. And Extreme Noise Terror happened to be hardcore vegans. And they were not having any sheep chopped up on stage with them. So it was Extreme Noise Terror who sort of cut down all the things they sort of
There's
wanted
an
to do.
irony for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole thing, when you had to walk past the sheep that was sort of dumped on the steps afterwards, this was, as far as they saw it, this was all their plans had failed. Nothing had worked. That was the only thing they could sort of think to do.
Well, they were having, obviously, kind of a bad effect on each other. And this leads naturally to the event that we were talking about right at the beginning, which was which defines them really, which was the burning of the £1 million. Now, firstly, this happened. They went to Jura. They had a boathouse, didn't they? Only 4 people were there, I think. Phil and Jimmy, I think they're roadie?
Gimpo,
the roadie.
Yeah.
Trustworthy the person to authenticate what happened. And I think a journalist or somebody.
A journalist called Jim Reed,
that's right.
Who wrote the article that I clipped. In fact, when I met him, I got him to sign the article for me. It's one of my most treasured sort of things.
Now, it would be possible to think that they didn't burn the £1 million.
A lot of people will cling to that belief,
but even if it wasn't $1 million, they certainly burned a huge amount of money, didn't they?
Yeah, and
I'd like to think it was $1 million.
The BBC did forensic analysis on the ashes, because they took all the ashes in the suitcase and sort of brought it back, and eventually it was turned into this brick. And the forensic analysis came back going, yeah, these are all burnt £50 notes. Someone's burnt an awful lot of money. But it's more people who knew them talk of them of being haunted by what they've done. Like they've never really recovered.
I think that's really interesting. Because anybody in this room and anybody listening would feel the same way. If you had burnt £1 million, and these are guys with families and with children, and there's another element of it, which you mentioned in the book, was that, if Elton John just squandered various millions by just buying flowers or gifts or doing something stupid, which he did all the time. Mm-hmm. Nobody cared. They just go, that's Elton John, that's his money, do what he wants. But to take this money and to burn it, it could have bought kidney dialysis machines, it could have been hospital wings, it could have done something incredibly important. And on a domestic level, it could have been, he's living with his children, who must be thinking, they burnt, and we must get on to the back catalogue, which they deleted and lost more money through that. But they must be haunted by it. And people say they were changed after that event.
What bastards. What a terrible thing to do. Because with Elton John, the money that he sort of squanders sort of sloshes around the, economy anyway. So it doesn't feel bad. To sort of destroy money, like to negate it, that's a taboo. What they've done in our society is a real taboo. And it's no wonder so many people were sort of shocked and angry about it. And a lot of it was because after the Brit Awards, they kind of had the realization that you can't fight the music industry. You know, whatever you do, it will absorb. The songs of Kurt Cobain are like covered by the Muppets these days, and the songs of the Sex Pistols are played to the Queen at the 2012 Olympics. They become absorbed into their heritage. You can't attack it. The only thing they could do was just not to play, was to sort of walk away. This is why they then deleted their entire catalogue, which they could do because they did everything independently, which would have cost them at least 5 million.
5 million, another 5 million. So,
yeah.
They had offers for film soundtracks, they had offers for advertising,
absolutely,
probably jingles, phone. I mean, I can't imagine. They're very well-known songs, and
they were, but because they did that, it was almost like they were deleting themselves from the history of music. They were sort of removing themselves, and for a band that was so big and so massive and so successful, they almost became forgotten, as they were trying to do. They almost were removed from people's popular sort of memory. They're a bit too strange. Did that really happen? We're not entirely sure.
So they not only removed themselves, but they lost all that money as well,
yeah,
on a personal level as well, which is absolutely incredible.
To sort of do, but they still had £1 million that they'd made. And it's like it was tainted to them. It was like that was from the music industry, and they didn't know what to do with it. And they were trying to do art things, never fall for the art trip. They were trying to sort of go down there. And that's a lot to do with why they went to Jura, because, if they'd have taken the £1 million and burnt it in an art gallery in London, people would have understood it on some level. They might have thought it was terrible. Like, that's terrible art. That's a terrible, immoral, cruel, stupid thing to do. But it's art, because it's in an art gallery. By going out into, into the Scottish Highlands, and there's a deserted sort of boathouse, it wasn't that. It wasn't just an art thing. And that made it harder to find. That made it harder for people to sort of get their heads around it and comprehend what they'd done.
So they did sort of come back in 2017 at one point and various little projects. But do you feel that the whole thing is effectively over now?
Well, it's a good question. I do think that if they hadn't burnt the money, they would have succeeded in being forgotten. They would have vanished from our cultural maps of the late 20th century.
It's true. It's the one thing that everyone still remembers about.
Yeah, but people, especially me, I couldn't get that money burning home. I couldn't process it. It just made no sense. It was awful, but it wasn't just awful. There was something.
Have they ever admitted that they're remorseful about it?
Well, I mean, they've said a lot about it. There's a lot of quotes where sometimes they regret it, but sometimes they don't, and so forth. But it sort of became, if you go back and read all their interviews, it kind of became very, very clear to me that they didn't really know why they'd done it. They'd felt a compulsion, and the compulsion was so strong that they acted on it. And I always say, it's one thing to start burning £1 million, but to finish is something. They just felt they had to do it. They didn't understand why, which is why the book I wrote is such a strange book, because I'm sort of trying to look beyond them to sort of a larger story, to look at the ideas that influence them and things like that, to try and put it into some form of context. And it has additional material.
What have you added to it?
The new edition, the 10th anniversary edition. The book is unchanged, the text is unchanged, but what I did was I went back 10 years later and wrote 13,000 words of footnotes, where I looked back at the book after 10 years and try and make sense of it myself, I think. And so it's a lot of me going, that bit's bad, I'm sorry about that, or whatever. Me trying to sort of analyse the book, because it's an odd book in that it's got a life of its own like no other. I mean, I initially just wrote it and self-published it as an e-book, because at that time Kindles had been invented, and for the first time you could put something out and people could get it. which was new, right? We didn't sort of have that. Suddenly I thought, I could do that KLF thing because it's been in my head. I could get it out and I could move on, right? That was my thinking. I'd get it out. Not that many people interested, but I could do it and sort of move on. And the book just, I don't quite know how it's like a living thing. It started to take off, and then publishers got interested, and I was picked up by an agent, and then it came out in paperback, and it sort of keeps selling, and it just keeps selling, and every year it keeps selling. And
well, it does. It's constantly selling, isn't it? Fantastic.
It's just pure word of mouth. It's basically people reading it and going, "Oh, I've got to talk to someone about this. You must read this book."
And it's appealing now to people who don't really even know the KLF story. They're not buying it because they were KLF fans or whatever. They're just saying this is an absolutely extraordinary
What
story.
I love is when it gets to like the younger generation.
Yeah.
People who were raised on, as I was talking about, the Simon Cowell sort of TV world, where to be a musician, you had to sit in front of like the panel of judges and do everything right. You had to do what they expected of you. And if you did everything right, then you could progress as a musician. But to do everything right implies that, well, it's already been done. Someone's done that before. Probably doesn't need doing. The creative impulses behind Bill and Jimmy's work were so different to that whole X Factor pop idol sort of world, that for musicians who grew up during that period, I think it comes as a real revelation. No, this is why we're musicians. This is what we should be doing. These are the impulses that we need to sort of pay attention to.
Well, it really is. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and I'm not surprised it's been selling, and it's selling tonight, indeed.
Oh, lovely, very good.
And John would be very happy to sign copies. So we're going to take a little break now and come back in about 15 minutes or so with Ian Brody. But for the time being, John Higgs, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.